Let's talk about some disorders that can affect membrane potentials and therefore action potentials. So these clinical connections that are in your notes in almost every set are to reinforce the normal physiology, not because this is a patho class, but I do generally test on at least one of these on every test. I won't tell you which one. So this set of clinical connections is going to be related to what happens if your ion composition fluctuates in such a way that it can have an impact on your likelihood of producing action potentials. So in each of these situations, and there are 4 of them, the name has sort of a consistent thing that it's telling you. I've got hypokalemia, hyperkalemia, hypocalcemia, and hyponatremia, which is on the next page. In each situation, what it's telling you, hypo-K, low potassium, the Latin for potassium starts with K, I don't remember what it is. Low potassium where? So where would you have an ion imbalance first, the ECF or the ICF? Yeah, it would happen in the ECF first. So all of these are disturbances that occur in the ECF that will eventually affect your ability to produce an action potential. Okay, so hypokalemia, low potassium, where? Extracellular fluid. Hyperkalemia, high potassium, where? Extracellular fluid. Hypocalcemia, low calcium, where? Extracellular fluid. And the last one on the next page is hyponatremia, low Na, sodium, where? Extracellular fluid. So this tells you what is occurring, and all of this stuff has to do with this occurring, okay? So let's start with hypokalemia. Hypokalemia is low potassium in the extracellular fluid. Why might this occur? Well, massively decreased intake, like if you were in starvation conditions and you weren't getting potassium really at all. But importantly, all of these hypos can occur with massive amounts of fluid loss. Vomiting, diarrhea, diuretics, because of course ions are very, very hydrophilic, and when you lose fluids you tend to lose ions as well. There is a hormone that we will learn about this semester quite often, and it's called aldosterone. Aldosterone regulates sodium and potassium, and so if that one's weird, then you can have problems with sodium and or potassium. And then your kidneys are really important in regulating ion composition, so if they're going down on you, you could end up with any of these problems. Okay, so what does it mean if you have, what does it mean to your likelihood of getting an action potential if you have low potassium in the extracellular fluid? Well, it's going to screw up your potassium concentration gradient. Okay, so generally your potassium concentration gradient is 30 inside to 1 outside, right? But I've lost a whole bunch of potassium outside, so now maybe it's 30 to 0.1, which is 300 to 1, right? Okay, so I've got a really steep concentration gradient when I'm sitting at rest. So I want to look at what that will do to your ability to get an action potential. So let's look at that. So before I had hypokalemia, and I don't have an action potential yet. I'm just sitting at resting membrane potential, minding my own business, right? But then I get hypokalemia for whatever the heck reason. And then what happens? Well, I sit there at rest, and my potassium concentration gradient is really steep when I'm sitting there at rest. So what happens is at rest, through my leak channels, a whole bunch of potassium is going to leave the cell. And as a whole bunch of potassium leaves the cell, what's that going to do? Well, when potassium leaves the cell, does it depolarize or does it hyperpolarize? Which one does potassium do? Just sitting there, haven't even involved gated channels yet, but it's just going really, really fast through the leak channels. So you are going to sit there at rest and you can become hyperpolarized at rest. So you're just sitting here hyperpolarized at rest. And then let's say you're a neuron, and what you try to do is now you say, oh, okay, I want to have an action potential because I'm a neuron and that's my job. So I try to have an action potential, and whereas my action potential would normally have to go from here to here, right? Now it tries to do it and it goes from here to here and it doesn't hit threshold, right? So the cell is sitting around hyperpolarized because of the hypokalemia, and it makes it way harder to depolarize to threshold. It's much harder to hit an action potential. So it's kind of like the cell is sitting around all the time in the relative refractory period. So which body systems will this impact really dramatically? It's going to impact all of your electrical system. It's going to impact the nervous system and the muscular system, your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, all of those. So what kinds of symptoms are associated with hypokalemia? Muscle weakness, because I tried to get an action potential but I didn't get one. Fatigue, both mental and physical fatigue, sluggish reflexes, and it can cause cardiac arrhythmias, which is really important. So cardiac arrhythmias can, of course, lead to a higher likelihood of heart attack. It's not causing a heart attack, it just leads to a higher likelihood of heart attack. Okay, so what about the next one? The next disorder is hyperkalemia. Okay, this one is high potassium, hyper K, in the extracellular fluid. So this one's really interesting. So why might you have hyperkalemia? Massively increased intake, but only if your kidneys are not working for you, okay? So if your kidneys are insufficient and you're taking in just ridiculous amounts of potassium, like more than you could generally take in, but your kidneys can't clear it all out, then you could get hyperkalemia. But importantly, this is also how we execute people via death by lethal injection. I'll tell you why it works that way in just a second. Severe and extensive damage to cell membranes, like in a burning situation when someone has burns over massive areas of their body, all of that potassium was sequestered in the intracellular fluid, and then you damage so many cell membranes that it dumps into the extracellular fluid and starts circulating. That can cause hyperkalemia. And then aldosterone, that same hormone we talked about, if that one is wrong in the other way, you can get hyperkalemia. So what is the impact here? The impact here is that the concentration gradient for potassium is screwed up again. It's supposed to be, again, 30 inside to 1 outside, but now I have too much in the extracellular fluid. So now maybe it's 30 to 10, which is 3 to 1, okay? And that can affect the number, but even more importantly, it's going to affect your ability to repolarize. Because remember, this repolarization phase was all about getting potassium to move quickly back quickly out of the cell for repolarization. So too much potassium in the extracellular fluid makes it difficult to repolarize the cell. So I depolarized, everything's fine. I closed my sodium channels, I opened my potassium channels, but now potassium will not move out effectively because instead of being 30 to 1, it's now 3 to 1, right? So you kind of get stuck here. So it makes it difficult to quickly repolarize the cell after an action potential. And if you can't get out of the refractory period, you can't have more action potentials. So what are some symptoms of this? Massive changes in the EKG or ECG. What happens is with your EKG, you're supposed to depolarize cardiac muscle and then repolarize and then depolarize. It's supposed to be very rhythmic. If you can't repolarize, then you lose the rhythmicity. Severe muscle weakness, which can lead to paralysis. So it's that serious. And then here's the kicker. It may and often does cause cardiac arrest with hyperkalemia, because if you depolarize a cardiac muscle cell and it can't repolarize, you can't use it again. Mortality with hyperkalemia is up to 67% if untreated. And what we do with death by lethal injection in this country and in this state, and I'm from Texas, and Texas executes a lot of people via death by lethal injection. What we do is we give usually a triple cocktail of a muscle relaxer so that the death by lethal injection is less uncomfortable for the people who are watching. We usually give also an anxiolytic, anxiety reducer for the person who is being executed. And then we give a massive dose of potassium to stop the heart. Now, for those of you who are interested in things like this, and I find this both very interesting from a physiological perspective and also from a sociological and political perspective, there's a fantastic podcast that talks about the nature of cruel and unusual punishment, chasing lethal injection drugs around the world, because interestingly, a lot of the drugs that we used for lethal injections for that triple cocktail were made in other countries that actually don't have capital punishment. And when people in those countries were alerted that it was being used this way, they shut down distribution to the United States. And so there's some really interesting history that goes with that. Not even history, really interesting current information that goes with that. So that's hyperkalemia. Okay, now hypocalcemia. So this one, we haven't talked about calcium's role in this very much, but it's kind of interesting. So with calcium, hypocalcemia, low calcium in the extracellular fluid, causes, again, decreased intake, but massively. Lack of vitamin D, because you can't absorb calcium without vitamin D. And there's two hormones that I teach in anatomy. You may not have learned them before, but you'll learn them this semester. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin are both responsible for regulating calcium concentration in the bloodstream. So here's the deal. In your electrically excitable tissues, imagine that this is a gated sodium channel. The latch on the gate is extracellular calcium. Okay, so as long as the latch is there, the gate opens when I tell it to. Okay, if the latch is gone, then the gate opens without stimulus. Okay, so keep that in mind. In all electrically excitable tissues, calcium binds to sodium channels and keeps them closed until you open them. But when extracellular calcium is low, what happens is some of your gated sodium channels will open without a stimulus because they don't have a latch. And then sodium will move into the cell. So let's see what happens in a situation like that again. Okay, so let's look at that. So we're going along, minding our own business. We've got resting membrane potential sitting around -70, and then we get hypocalcemia. And when we get hypocalcemia, what happens is some of our sodium channels open when we didn't mean them to. So instead of sitting around at -70, I'm sitting around at -60 or -65. And then what happens is maybe I start what I thought was just going to be a graded potential. So I thought this was just going to be a graded potential. And no, that one's a graded potential. This was a slightly stronger graded potential. And if it started from here, it just would have been graded. But if it starts from here, I get an accidental action potential. Okay, so I get accidental and inappropriate action potentials with hypocalcemia. So it makes it easier to send an action potential even when you didn't want to. What are some symptoms? Nerves and muscles will have spontaneous inappropriate action potentials. So you can get cramps and spasms and exaggerated reflexes. You can even get into serious convulsions and tetanic contractions in which your muscles cannot contract. And this, in certain really serious situations, can be deadly. So what are some symptoms of long-term low calcium that can lead to hypocalcemia? Well, dry skin, psoriasis, coarse hair, brittle nails, but these are also symptoms of just living here in the desert, so it doesn't mean we all have hypocalcemia. Okay, and then the last one is hyponatremia. So low hypo, Na, sodium, in the extracellular fluid. So what's happening here? So causes of this: decreased intake, not generally a problem with most of our diets. Excessive loss of fluids, sweating, vomiting, diarrhea, diuretics. Kidney failure. Kidneys regulate your ion composition. There are some hormones that are involved in your salt and water balance. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and aldosterone are those. Poor diet, especially combined with lots of diuretics. Alcohol is a diuretic. So poor diet combined with lots of beer. That was pretty much a Texas summer when I was growing up. There's also MDMA use. MDMA, which is often referred to as ecstasy or Molly. Almost everyone who's died from using MDMA has died related to ion composition, not what happens with their brain. We'll talk about how MDMA really works later in the semester, but I'll tell you what it has to do with this when we're talking about the hyponatremia. So the most common electrolyte imbalance is hyponatremia. It will often land you in the hospital because you act like a wackadoodle when you've got hyponatremia. So here's the deal. It's going to screw up your concentration gradient for sodium, and that's problematic because, of course, you've got too little sodium in the extracellular fluid. Should be 15 outside to 1 inside. Now maybe it's 5 to 1. Okay, so that's a problem. So it's going to be harder to depolarize because my concentration gradient is what gets me to go from here to here. So that means it's going to cause some muscle weakness, and because of the impact on your digestive tract, the smooth muscle, it can cause some nausea. But importantly, it actually impacts your osmosis, because what it does is it takes your cells from sitting in hold on just a second. I want a blank whiteboard. Okay, it takes your cells from sitting in an isotonic solution to low concentration of solutes out here, same in here. And what happens if you have a low concentration of solutes is that comparatively, that means you have a high concentration of water compared to a low concentration of water. And if the solutes are non-penetrating, what's the water going to do? The water is going to move in. This is just an osmosis thing, right? So it has a profound osmotic effect on the water content of all cells. And if this were a brain cell, which it isn't because I didn't draw it right, but stick with me. If this were a brain cell, it causes your brain cells to swell, your neurons to swell, and you get dramatic neurological symptoms because structure-function relationship with cells, change the structure of your cell, change the function of your cell, act like a wackadoodle. Somebody takes you to the hospital because they think you are drunk or on drugs, and you might be, but you also just might be severely, severely dehydrated when you lose all that water. It happens all the time in Texas to people like training football full pads in the middle of summer, get really, really dehydrated, and so you act like a wackadoodle and they take you into the doctor. So this is also associated, however, with really low plasma volume, low blood pressure, hypotension. So you might act a little wackadoodle. You might even be a little aggro, but you don't have, you like can take a swing and you kind of fall down because you're really weak because of all your low blood pressure and your low plasma volume. Now, why is this associated with MDMA? MDMA, there are clinical uses for MDMA. It's in clinical trial for some PTSD and some other things, but I'm talking about recreational use of MDMA. Makes you have a lot of energy, lasts for a very long time, depresses your thirst response. You're not thirsty, you're dancing in the desert, for instance, at Burning Man, for instance, for 5-6 hours, and you're not thirsty at all, and you sweat out all of your fluid and you get yourself some hyponatremia. And if you're not treated for it, then you can actually die because of the impact on your cells. So, note to self, whenever you are doing anything outside that might make you lose fluid volume, you need to replace both your fluids and your electrolytes. So, take a Gatorade with you. Safety first. Okay, so last little tidbit here is that there is a really good interaction for those of you who like to play around with things. It's right here. There's also a news article about a nurse who accidentally gave somebody a potassium injection when they didn't need one and what happened. So this practice membrane potentials with a simulation, this is really cool and it's free. So what you can do with this one is you have a legend: sodium, potassium, gated channels, all that kind of stuff, leak channels. And then you can put in the charges to see what it looks like. You can put in the relative concentrations, see where things are high versus low. You can put in the chart. You can stimulate the neuron. And watch what happens, right? You can change some things around. You can watch it actually occur. So this gives you a little bit of practice, and you can sort of watch what's happening to the channels at different times. So for instance, right now, all I'm doing is seeing things move through leak channels. But then if I stimulate the neuron again, it's not like you close the leak channels, because you never do, but you open potassium channels, potassium moves in, sodium moves out. Okay, so you can play with this. Especially for those of you who are kinesthetic, who need a little practice. All right, and that is it for membrane potentials.